I recently bought a lithium battery for my kayak trolling motor, and since this new battery is small enough and light enough, and because it was more expensive than I would like to admit, I decided to put the battery in my kayak milk crate since a milk crate goes with me on every fishing trip. But now that the battery is inside the crate, I need to add a lockable lid so that the battery and the other items inside of it are a little more secure when I stop for coffee or the bathroom in between the 2 hours it takes me to get to the Texas Gulf Coast from my house. Now, while the idea behind adding a lockable lid to the milk crate is primarily about securing the battery inside of it, a couple of side benefits in keeping the battery inside of the milk crate instead of inside of a battery box like the way I used to do with my lead acid battery is that number one, it cleans up my kayak deck space since I no longer have a battery box sitting on top of it. And number two, I can get on the water a little sooner since I don't have a battery box to have to tie down or have to deal with. My milk crate is rectangular, so I went on eBay and found another rectangular milk crate for about $15. So went ahead and ordered it, and when it came in, I cut the bottom of it off with my oscillating saw, and then knocked down any high spots or rough spots with my sander and 60 grit sandpaper. So this was relatively easy and didn't take too much time. So for the cutting and sanding, it was probably about 20 minutes. Since most of the fishing I do is on the salty Texas Gulf Coast, I'm using stainless steel for everything on this build, including the screws and bolts, since stainless has good corrosion resistant properties. Stainless costs a little bit more up front, but it'll be well worth it in the long run if this helps me buy time in between replacing parts or repairing parts because of rust. To install the hardware on the crate and lid, I ended up adding plastic pieces to build up the areas where screws are going to be installed, since these spots are not flat. Adding these small plastic tabs enabled the hardware to sit flush, and also gave more material for the screws to drive into, making it stronger. To glue the pieces in, I used plastic JB Weld epoxy that I picked up from Home Depot for about $7 or $8. But before gluing the plastic pieces to the crate, I scuffed up the area and plastic pieces with 60 grit sandpaper to give the epoxy more to grab onto. And then I cleaned the area and pieces really well with acetone that I had left over from another project. If you don't have acetone, rubbing alcohol also works well. I ended up mixing the epoxy and hardener from the plastic weld kit and then added a generous amount to the back of the pieces before setting them in their permanent place. The JB Weld is a high viscosity epoxy and has a peanut butter consistency once it's mixed. So I didn't have to worry about the pieces falling out before the epoxy had time to cure. So the next day, I checked to see how well the pieces had dried and was pleased to see that they had set up hard as concrete. The eyelets that I had added for anchoring the crate to the kayak also set up nicely. So the next time I'm on the water, I can feel confident that if the worst were to happen and I ended up flipping my kayak, that the crate would not fall out of the back of the kayak. So before driving the screws into the plastic tabs, I pre-drilled some pilot holes to help with screw alignment and also to help keep the small plastic pieces from blowing out once I inserted the screws. The Minn Kota battery box I used before buying the lithium battery that I have now had the circuit breaker built into it. So I had to buy a new 60 amp waterproof circuit breaker from Amazon for about $25 to protect the new battery. I decided to install the circuit breaker on the floor of the lid rather than mounting it inside the crate to save the space inside the crate. I also installed a female trolling motor connector on the wall of the lid as well to connect the battery to the trolling motor. My Minn Kota trolling motor is mounted on the bow of the kayak, so I have another female connector mounted inside the wall of the kayak near the back where the milk crate is going to sit. Um, to make the electrical connections between the battery, the female connector, and the circuit breaker. I used a number eight American wire gauge marine grade cable that I purchased from Amazon for about $27. It came as a kit and included 10 feet of red, 10 feet of black cable, brass eyelets on the ends of the cables, and a couple of butt connectors for splicing cables together. Um, I connected the negative of the battery to the negative of the trolling motor connector, and then I connected the positive of the battery to the line side of the circuit breaker, and then connected the load side of the circuit breaker to the positive of the female connector. I did consider using just regular THHN number eight copper wire that you might find like on a commercial construction site or maybe at your house, but it's not so malleable or not so flexible. So I decided against this because the area inside the milk crate, it's kind of tight. So if you have a wire that's not so flexible, it doesn't make it real easy to open up the lid. I wanted to add a small cover above the circuit breaker and a female connector that I installed in the wall of the lid to give some protection against direct sunlight and water splash. So I cut a rectangular piece of plastic about 3 inches wide that went across the width of the crate. I roughed up the piece of plastic in the section of the wall it was going to sit on with 60 grit sandpaper and cleaned them up with acetone. Sorry. I straightened up the wall with some piece of wood and before gluing it down. And then added a few screws for good measure just to make sure it held real good. After it dried up, I added a small 6-inch piece of yak attack rail on top of the plastic cover to set my flagpole on, since this is the highest point on my kayak for visibility, and it is furthest back so it wouldn't be in the way when I'm casting. Last thing I did before wrapping this up was I added a small 3/4 inch by 3/4 inch piece of aluminum stock on the bottom of the milk crate to keep the battery from moving around. So it's acting more like a retaining wall so that the battery is not moving whenever I'm transporting.